Good morning, everybody. So we are going to be doing a new series just throughout the summer. We're going to just do from the rabbi's desk. There's a lot of fascinating questions which come up all the time. Real life is much more fascinating than any kinds of fiction because it's real. And so let's take a moment to appreciate that as we learn a little bit together. So here's the deal. What we're going to do is we're going to start looking a little bit at this particular shaila. And this particular shaila that actually comes from Maryland. Maryland now, but this actually happens every few months. This shaila keeps coming up because it really is in different permutations. The shaila is that in this particular case, it is flatware, which is 15 years old, is an heirloom family flatware, which was dairy and needs to be now. The question is, can it be reoriented to be meat? Can it re-identify itself as fleischig? Flatware. This question comes up in very many different permutations. It happens sometimes in a different way where I was cooking or somebody in my kitchen was cooking and they made something which was usually the way this works is I have a parav pot or a parav knife which ends up being involved in some sort of fleischig or milchig activity. Can I salvage it as a parav equipment or not? That's the question that usually comes up. This question is slightly different, but this happens a lot of time, and we kind of get the sense that there is a problem with this. But what is the problem with this? So we're going to do a brief background of the halacha and the dissent in this halacha and the exceptions to this halacha. Very fascinating halacha in general. So let's start at the very beginning. Happens to be there's a lot of wonderful things that are written on this. A lot of the sources for this can be found in the Darkei Teshuvah, which summarizes most of these opinions. And there's an excellent article by Rabbi Jakta in called Torah on this topic. Really, a lot that's written and worthwhile considering. We'll start at the very beginning. This is actually a halacha in a lot of the halachas of Kashring appear in the halachas of Pesach. In the Shulchan Aruch, this is where a lot of this applies to us. This actually happens to be in halachas of Yom Tov, in the Shulchan Aruch, which is talking about what you can do and what you cannot do on Yom Tov. And the Shulchan Aruch tells us in source 1, Mutar lalaben b'Yom Tov, kli barzel she'avu boy palavin shel gavina v'acher halibon yofer boy pashtida shel basar. So you're allowed to kasher. Libun is where you're kashering through hot or dry heat. To a high temperature, a utensil, an iron utensil, which has been used for some sort of cheese dish, then therefore afterwards to use it for a meat dish. You're not allowed to kasher from treif to kosher. You can kasher from milk to meat, is what the Shulchan Aruch says. So from a technical perspective, it sounds like the Shulchan Aruch says it's all right to go from one to the other. However, it's worthwhile noting that there's a minhag which is noted by the Magen Avram. This is where this whole topic starts in source 2, where he says, "Umikan mashma shemuta b'chol lahagil kli chalav ule'echol by basar or ipcha." It sounds like you can go from meat to milk and milk to meat, no problem. That's what it sounds like in general. V'ha'olam noagim isur b'davar. He says, however, generally speaking, people are no longer doing this, says the Magen Avram. And he quotes the Gaon Marab Binyamin Mipozna, Shishama Maram Yafeh, Maram Yafeh Atam Leminag, Shim Yase Ken Olam Lo Yihye Lo Rak Kli Echad, V'Yagilenu Kol Pam Sheyishtamish Boy V'Zeh Aser Dilma Aser Limitei. So he says, you know what? What's going to happen? If you're allowed to kasher from milk to meat and meat to milk, people are economically, conservative. So what are they going to do? They're going to have one pot, one pan, and they're going to go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And inevitably, there's going to be a problem. Whether they realize there's a problem, whether they don't realize there's a problem, what's going to happen is they're going to forget. What was it today? What did I have for breakfast? Was it, did I fry my sausages and my egg? Did I put my milk in my omelet? I don't even remember what was it. There's like a, imagine it'll be a Jewish invention. There'll be like a blue and red switch on the handle, as to what it is now. I'm going to forget what it is. I'm like, so he says it's not a good idea because it'll end up being that people will have less kalim, and there's going to be a problem. We'll have one set of flatware, and then you just don't know what's happening. Which dish rack you even put it in? It's going to be a balagan. Don't do it. He says, and he quotes this Gemara in Chulin. So he says, then he says, wait a second, but how can you go against the Shulchan Aruch? The Shulchan Aruch just says you can. So he says, v'had sharin nahacha. So did anybody pick up the difference? What was that? No, good guess. Any kalim would work the same. Good. He says, He says the Shulchan Aruch talk about a case of libun, not hagala. What's the difference between libun versus hagala? Libun is what we call a self-cleaning oven, right? Where we, through dry heat, it heats up to an incredible temperature. We're talking about 900 degrees, it goes red hot, burns out anything on it or in it. That's libun. But when it comes to hagala, what's hagala? Hagala is when I use water to do it. So let's say I have a pot which I was using to cook and it needs to be kashered, and then or let's say to make it simpler, I have my spoon gets trafed up. So then I put my spoon into boiling water, and then I take it, I put it under cold water. That's hagala. How do I know which to do when? What's the rule? The rule is kabbalah kach palto, which means the way it was trafed up is the way it becomes kosher. So if my spoon was involved in a liquid, in a liquid trafe situation, it was a milchik spoon, it went into a fleshik pot, and it was stirring a soup, then I need to do hagala. But if, let's say, I have something which should now touch the food directly, it wasn't that it was through the medium of water, now I would need to do libun, right? Because libun is dry heat, right? So that would be a more, and in that case, it sounds like you can. Okay, yes.
Didn't this start out by saying you're going from Hanavi to Basoi?
Yes. But both ways. It goes both ways. So the Shulchan Aruch is talking about what you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, and he says you can do a libun from Chalavi to Basari. And the Magen Avraham says it's not a good idea to go either way because you're going to end up having mix-ups, but that's limited to the case of Hagala. Hagala is much easier to do than libun, right? Hagala is, I put the pot on the boil, it comes to a boil, 3 minutes later, I drop the spoon and I take it out, put it under cold water, I'm done. That's Hagala, I'm done. Right? So it says that should not be done cross-orientation. Okay, so that's what he says. Now, he quotes, he actually says, as we see in the Gemara in Chulin, that's interesting. I don't remember seeing this in the Gemara. So what is the Gemara talking about there in Chulin? So actually note, by the way, that it's actually misnumbered. It's not Tesam Abayz, it's Chesam Abayz. But the Gemara in Chulin is talking about the practice that a person who is a shoichet should have. And the Gemara describes, I just brought the Gemara over here in source 3, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Hatabach, a person who is a slaughterer, a shoichet, tzorich l'shloisha sakinim, would really require, best practice is to have 3 knives. Why? Achas shoichet ba, one which is simply for shechting, v'achas shemachatech ba, so one is for afterwards cleaving the meat into the correct cuts, which is going to now distribute. And the other one is to cut up, what's chalavim? Fats, yeah, not chalav as milk, but chalavim, fats. There are certain fats which we're not allowed to eat, we're not allowed to consume. That being the case, so you have a separate knife for that as well. And by the way, today it's not as common because the shoichet is usually not the butcher, right? So we've bifurcated, as in most industries where we've sort of specified. So shoichet is only in charge of slaughtering, and then we have other people who are now afterwards cutting up the meat. But be as a matter, when it used to be all in one, which is the way that generally everything used to work, is that one person sort of overseed from beginning to end, as opposed to the person who in the button factory is just putting the button on the conveyor belt, like that's. So we've moved into a specificity, but in the day where everybody used to do everything, better to have 3 knives. So the Gemara says, so no, you know what? Why make it so complicated? Have a knife, and then you should use it to cut up meat, and then you should cut up the chalavim, the asr fats afterwards. So maybe he's going to switch it around. Maybe he's going to start off cutting the chalavim, which is asr, and then touch the meat. So he says, well, in this case, he'll also mix up. He has two knives, right? So he's going to use the one for the wrong thing. It says, Kavan ditztrichinu, trey islu hekera. No, he's going to put a cut. He's going to have a red, a blue, a yellow, a green. He'll start making a kerim, so he'll know now. It'll be more easy for him to differentiate. So the Magen Avraham is quoting a source which is using this as a possibility, is that when it comes to kashrus, it's better to have more. People have this question when it comes to like Pesach. Can I kasher my XYZ for Pesach? Can I kasher my microwave for Pesach? Folks, a microwave is $40, right? It's like what you can get, or whatever it is. These days, you just buy another one, right? Don't in the old days where people barely had anything to put on the table and they had to kasher everything, and all the halachas of kashering on Pesach are there to be able to see how to get from one to the other. Okay. But today, it's get a new Keurig. I'm saying it's not so difficult just to have a Pesach item. It's not so expensive to have another one. It's better not to have to rely on kashering, right? And that's what we're seeing from over here is don't have something which could end up in the wrong drawer. Right, just make sure to have two, and that's what the Magen Avraham is saying: is don't kasher with the minhag of the olam. He's saying, I've noticed that the predominant practice is not to go from one to the other, when milk to meat in this particular case, and that has become the minhag. How accepted has this been? So it turns out that there are those who disagree. So as an example, the Aruch HaShulchan, Rav Yechiel Michael Epstein, in source 4 says, Yesh mi sheroitze lamar she'ein lahagil kli shel basar leshel cholav or lehepech mitam shema lo yeh lo rak mikli echad v'yigalenu b'basar lecholav micholav lebasar v'asar limitay b'chumra yaserahi ve'en lanu ligzor gzeros midatenu. He says you can't just suddenly start new gezeros. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't talk about this. The Gemara doesn't talk about this. And now suddenly, in the times of the Magen Avraham, 350 years ago, suddenly now everything, right? Then suddenly new ideas start coming in. He says you can't make a new gezeros. The Aruch HaShulchan says this is not a fully fledged practice. Similarly, the Shach also seems to make the observation. We're not going to read it inside. Doesn't seem to be a common practice. However, it's worthwhile noting that today it has been fully accepted. And part of the reason also it's fully accepted is there's lots of exceptions to it. So it's very easy to keep this halacha because there are lots of exceptions. So let's look at some of those exceptions. But today it's taken as for granted. Rav Moshe Feinstein talks about it. We're not going to go through it for the sake of time, but Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked about the classic case of I find my dairy spoon in my meaty dish rack, right? And what am I going to do in this case? Can I kasher it just in case? Is this an infringement of this? Rav Moshe takes it for granted that this halacha is in application. This Magen Avraham over here is in application. So you have to be careful about this. So what do we do? So there are a number of exceptions. We're going to examine a few exceptions which are very helpful for us. Number one is the Eshel Avram. The Eshel Avram is the Prima Gadim. On this Magen Avraham, where he points out that at the very top of page 3, he says, you know how you can resolve this? Such an interesting observation. It's counterintuitive. What's lahatriv? Comes the word treif. So therefore, it's better to make it treif first. Which means, here's the irony, it is easier to kasher from treif to kosher than it is from milk to meat. Do you notice that? Because the gzeira is where it's too familiar. What's familiar is where I have milk and meat, and I'm going to use the same knife on both sides, and I'm going to go backwards and forwards, I'm going to forget which is backwards, which is forwards. That's a problem. But if it's treif, I can always kasher. I can always kasher treif. There are certain times where hagola might not work, depending for this, how intricate a design of the kli. But if it's treif, it's fine. So says the Prima Gadim, so you know you do, make a treif. If let's say I have a milchik kli and I want to make it fleishik, so make a treif and then I can kasher a treif kli. That's the yes, Leah. Yeah, but this is not libun. On Yom Tov. He's saying, what can you do on Yom Tov? I'm sorry, yes, you're right. That was halacha in Yom Tov, not halacha in kashrus. That's Orach Chaim Siman Taf Kuf Tes, which is about what are the permissibilities on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, you're not like kasher from treif, but on Yom, you certainly during the weekday you can. Good catch. Thank you for contextualizing. In this case, he says, make a treif, and then you're good, which is a very strange kind of thing. And in fact, the Darkei Tshuva shouts at him and says, well, what are you talking about? That's terrible. That's a really bad precedent to sort of allow things. But nonetheless, it seems to be predominant practice. This is actually an accepted practice. It is better to make a treif than to kasher it, because now what you've also done is it's not just a game. What you've essentially done is you've created a wedge between the concern of what the Magen Avraham said, which is what's the Magen Avraham's concern? is that I'm going to keep my one pan and just go from this side of the counter to that side of the counter, this side of the counter to that side of the counter, depending on which omelet I'm cooking this morning, right? So that's the concern. If I'm making a treif, what I'm doing is I'm actively actually differentiating. I'm not going to. It's not a situation where I have one pan which I'm going to go backwards and forwards. It's probably a situation where I need to reorient something, and I don't have a way to do it because there's xeris. So how do I do? I make a treif. It's not going to be that I'm going backwards and forwards, treifing in the middle. That's not going to happen. So that's his suggestion. And in fact, I know a number of poskim who advise this as an option. So let's say it's milk. If you put into, let's say, a meaty pot, which is a ben yama, and you make a treif, then it's it would be sufficient. Other options are, and this comes up all the time, and I didn't realize how accepted this is kashring to parav. The Marasham, points out that the gzeira of the Magen Avram is about going from milk to meat and meat to milk. It's not about parav. And therefore, we can't extend this new gzeira to new circumstances. So therefore, and this is the most common application of this question, is I have my parav pot, and somebody in my kitchen used it to cook meat. Have I lost my parav pot? Is it now meat? And the answer is not necessarily. You can kasher it back to parav. You can't kasher it back to meat. And it makes, again, a lot of sense because here, it's not the kind of situation which is going to lead to the anarchy of the Magen Avram, of having one kli going backwards and forwards. I specifically need my parav knife. I need my parav pot. So if it lost its orientation, I'm allowed to kasher it back, and I'm allowed to make it parav again. That's another observation of the Marasham. Exception number 2. Exception number 1 is make it treif, then kasher it. Exception number 2 is make it parav. Exception number 3 we already looked at, and that is libun. Is that if it requires libun, which is a high intensity dry heat, then there's no gezerah as well. It's not as easy to do, and that's clearly what the Shulchan Aruch allowed, as we looked at the very beginning. The Shulchan Aruch says you can even do that on Yom Tov, in fact. So therefore, it would be allowed as well. Now, just to clarify this, Kabbalah Kach Palto generally means to say is that you usually have to use the type of methodology it became treif in to kasher it, right? Generally speaking. But you are allowed to use libun, works for everything. If you put something into a self-cleaning oven, that's called a libun gomer, everything's burnt out, and that's fine. That's totally fine. It's just a little complicated. Not everything can survive such intensity of heat as well, but that would not be under the purview of this Isser. And again, it's because the bar is a little higher for this as well. Another example of an exception is the Chasam Sofer talks about this, is he says Pesach, and this is a very helpful thing. Whenever I get a shaila on this nature within a month of Pesach, it's fantastic, because here's the deal. When it comes to Pesach, some people still today kasher their kalim for Pesach. So again, as I mentioned beforehand, today, thank God, go to Amazing Savings and get new flatware. It's easy, it's cheap, right? So it's just everyone should have new kalim for Pesach. But certainly, there are certain things which perhaps one cannot get, let's say a person cannot get an extra kli, or a person is going to kasher. It's a special kais, that I want to use the seder, or whatever it is that I want to kasher for Pesach. Once you kasher it for Pesach, it has been neutralized in terms of its chalav or basar orientation. So therefore, the suggestion, says the Chasam Sofer, is if, let's say, I have a pot which is meat, and I really want that to be a milk pot, you know what you should do? Wait till Pesach, kasher it for Pesach, now reorient it as the opposite orientation, and let it live through. Let it carry on after Pesach now, and keep it for the rest of the year in its new orientation, because Pesach is a allowed neutralizer, which is not going to lead to my pan on both sides of the counter on a haphazard basis. It'll be fine. That's what the Chasam Sofer says. Another 2 examples the Darkei Tshuva brings. One is a gift. This is not so common today because, generally speaking, you don't gift used kalim today. I mean, like, again, we live with so much wealth today relative to minus 150 years that, this is not even a shaila. But let's say that somebody comes to you and says, I was thinking about you, and I noticed that you were missing a pan for your meat, and I decided I was going to give you an extra meat pan. And you say, that's so nice, but I don't even have a milk pan. Can I kasher it for milk, right? So you can imagine this happening in the shtetl, and that's so nice, right? But I need it for milk. I don't even have a milk pan. So in that case, he says, well, in that case, that's fine because it's not within the purview of the Gzeira again, because the purview of the Gzeira is going backwards and forwards. It's not backwards and forwards. This is something which I didn't put in that situation. I did not start in this way. Somebody else did. I can now shift it as well. I can reshift it because I wasn't the one who put it there in the first place. And the last exception is accidents. And this applies a lot of times. Is this Gzeira is only applicable to doing this a priori, not post facto. What does that mean? Is that if I was the one who made it milk, I cannot make it meat, right? And if I made it meat, I cannot make it milk. But what happens if it's my meat pot, and it's always been my meat pot, and I always intended it for me to be my meat pot, but there was a splash, but it came into contact with something else, but an accident happened, right, which was not intentional. In that case, when such an accident happens, then you're allowed to kasher it. That's not what the Magen Avraham was talking about, which was the limitations of going backwards and forwards as well. So let's just reorient ourselves, just to put ourselves in perspective over here. Again, there is an Isra which is post Shulchan Aruch, although it is based on a Gemara about being careful about kashrus, about having different kalim and not going backwards and forwards, about the sakin of the shoichet, right? But this is applied in the halachas of Hagala, that one cannot go backwards and forwards from milk to meat and meat to milk. How accepted is this practice? We saw there are dissenting opinions, although today it's become predominantly accepted as well. In the Sephardic community is a question, but in the Ashkenazi community certainly. We saw what are the ways out of this. So we saw number one is make it treif, and then you can kasher it rather than being milk to meat. That creates a wedge. Number two is going to parav. If I lost a parav kli, I can go back to parav. Then exception number three is libun. If I'm kashering it through dry heat, which is a more intense heat, as opposed to agala, which is where this started. Number four is if I'm kashering it to Pesach, I neutralize it, now allowing it to have a neutral orientation. I can choose milk or meat and then live on through the rest of the year, no problem. And number five is gifts. If I received a gift, which is milk or meat, I can change it because I wasn't the one who put it in that situation. I don't have to be saddled with somebody else's choice. And number six is the idea of accidents. There was a splash, there was an accident, something happened, I'm allowed to kasher back in that situation as well. Yes?
Is it just metal? We're talking, what materials are we talking?
Anything which can be kashered.
Coated or anything?
Yeah, the general rules of kashering would apply to this, meaning to say things which would be not kasherable in general won't be kasherable, and things which are kasherable will be. Meaning, if I can kasher from treif to kosher, then the same questions would apply. It would be the same space that exists.
If you go to an auction or something, or you can buy sekum, like.
So actually, there are things which are it's worthwhile knowing, which are not so easy to kasher. And so things which are like intricate designs and multiple pieces that are screwed into each other, and there's like little, areas between then it becomes more complicated. But assuming that you have something which is kasherable and is of a material which is kasherable, that's fine. Glass is more complicated for the Ashkenazim. Plastic is a question lechatchila, depending. So there are questions, but generally speaking, most of the kalim that we're dealing with are kasherable kalim. Generally speaking, what was that? China, I don't remember. I don't think we can kasher China. China porcelain becomes is beyond our scope as well. I'm not sure about the thick. I'm not sure. Thick glaze could be an issue of glass, and if it's glass, then the Ashkenazim generally avoid that as well.
Once an item is neutralized, meat to dairy, dairy to meat, can you determine that it can become parav?
Good. Yes, that would be fine. Let's say in that situation that I have a kli which I have one way and I want to kasher it to parav. According to this, there'll be no problem with that, which is fascinating. If you completely neutralize it, yes.
Yeah, parav is the exact opposite of making a tray.
Exactly. Parav is sort of that completely safe zone as opposed to the completely oriented zone.